Following my last two videos on the virtues and potentials of shooting short exposure time subframes, I received a lot of questions, and today I'm going to skip the fancy VFX and just try to answer them. I also received a lot of comments. Some of them were interesting, some of them were accurate, and some were quite bizarre. I'll start with the comments that seem bizarre to me first, and just get those out the way. I'll begin with the comment from the person who was insisting that shooting short exposure time subframes will lead to posterization. I replied to him that, in point of fact, that isn't the case, and he could pop over to the Sky Story Astrobin and take a look at the images there. I have at this time over 100 images on the Sky Story Astrobin, that all of which were made using short exposure subframe strategies. And there is no posterization on any of them. There was no further comment from him on the matter. So let me take a moment to explain why you do not see posterization on short subframe exposure time astrophotography images. When shooting long subframe exposure times, you are fundamentally exposing for each subframe. But in shooting short subframe exposure times, you are exposing for the stack. As each sub is merged in the stacking software, the information captured in each sub is added to the information in every other sub. Now, this happens whether you shoot long or short subframe exposure times. But I guess you could say it matters more the shorter your subframe exposure time. In any event, what it means in the end is that 20 hours of stacking short subframes is worth about 20 hours of stacking long subframes. There's a little bit more to it than that, which we'll go into later on when I address another question. Suffice it for now to say that, in the end, whether shooting short or long subframe exposure times, you get the same amount of information in the final masters that the stacker outputs. So short subframe exposure times are not any more likely to lead to posterization than long subframe exposure times. It's the integration time that really matters, much more than the individual subframe exposure time. Another comment that was, well, not posted in the comment section below, but sent to me by email, was that my images were fake. Well, really the person said they were made by AI, but it amounts to the same thing, doesn't it? So, way back in my university days, and this was in the days when Photoshop was a brand new thing and special effects and images and photos had to be either done by hand, made with actual models and changing the set, or they had to be created with CGI. And in one of the courses I was taking at the time, a couple friends were talking about special effects and faking images and how it's done, and he had laughed and said, "Oh, you gotta be careful about those images done by those photomancers like Cliff, because you never can tell what you're getting." And because of that, and because I spent nearly a dozen years of my life pursuing scientific education, I became very fixed on sharing my methodologies, as well as pointing it out when I was faking an image just for fun. Like in those April Fool's videos that I like to do, I always put at the end of the video that it's just an April Fool's video, just in case somebody might forget and think it was for real. But to that person who sent me the email, I don't know who you were, it was an anonymous email. I have nearly 200 videos on my channel detailing how I shoot and how I develop the information. I do that so that you can replicate the outcomes. All you have to do is shoot the DSOs with good equipment from dark skies and follow the procedures, and you should be able to replicate the outcomes just fine. This, my friend, is the scientific method. Scientists form hypotheses, they test the data, they reach conclusions, and they share their conclusions and their methodologies so that others can try it for themselves. And all the methods that I use to shoot and develop information have been shared already on YouTube. And then one of the other more bizarre comments involved the image that I had posted in the last video of Quasar DWH M82-4 nearly 3 billion light years away, and two galaxies right beside it in that image, Galaxy SDSS J095 335.94 and a whole bunch of numbers beyond that, and Galaxy LIDA 2732338. 3.7 billion and 2.9 billion light years away respectively. And a person saying that he'd seen images with much more detail than what was captured here, and I'd like to see those images personally because I've seen the images taken from professional telescopes and they're not a lot different from this image that I shot with my Celestron C8. There's no doubt in my mind that a space telescope such as the Hubble or the JWST could pull more detail, a lot more detail. They don't have to contend with atmosphere, and they have gigantic mirrors. But I haven't really seen ground images with much more detail. If you know of one, honestly, please share it. Alright, that's the end of the comments section. Let's go to the questions. Question number 1, and honestly it's something I should have thought to put in the very first video, is what are short subframe exposure times? especially since it occurred to me after I made the second video that people often thought I was referring to speckle or lucky imaging. While lucky imaging is technically short subframe exposure time shooting, it is what I would consider at the far end of the extreme of short subframe exposure times. Lucky imaging is best used for bright solar system objects such as the moon and planets, with exposure times of 100 milliseconds or less. For shooting brighter deep sky objects, exposure times of 0.5 to 2 seconds are often used, with a specific goal of capturing thousands and thousands of images and paring them down to just the 10 to 25% sharpest in an effort to eliminate out much of the effects of our atmosphere on the images. And for that purpose, it is very good. But it has its own unique technical requirements and is not a methodology that I tend to use because, well, frankly, I don't get enough clear nights where I live to be okay with losing 75 to 90% of my data in calling. I have great dark skies, yes, but they're not often clear skies. Anyway, and please bear in mind this is just my personal definition, but I define short subframe exposure times as anything 300 seconds or less. And as I stated 2 videos back in subframe exposure time, the standard that I use with my rigs in determining the ideal exposure time for each one is to shoot a series of exposures going from a few seconds to up to 5 minutes, and then selecting the exposure that shows just enough structure of a moderately bright deep sky object that I can visually discern its structure. That allows me to visually rule out bad subs when I grade them later, and then when I run them through PixInsight Subframe Selector, for me to assess the subs that the Subframe Selector also wants to eliminate to make sure that the Subframe Selector is not doing anything weird. Whether you're letting your stacker or something like the Subframe Selector grade your subs, you really should monitor it. They often do weird stuff and accept things they shouldn't, or even more often, eliminate things they shouldn't. Bottom line, make sure you can see enough to grade the subs yourself, because if you trust applications and algorithms to do the work for you, you will be let down. So, I received various questions and comments in the comments section and personally on why I do not rely on the histogram when determining subframe exposure time. I mean, in photography, that's standard practice, right? You take a look at your histogram and make sure that you're not black clipping with a light curve going off the histogram to the left, or blowing out with a light curve going off the histogram to the right. And what I said in the previous video, how can astrophotographers capture faint detail when shooting short exposure subframes, is that I only use the histogram to make sure I'm not blowing out pixels. I don't worry about black clipping at all. So how does that work exactly? Why do I do that? Well, the histogram tool shows you how your sensor is responding per subframe. You shoot an exposure, and it assesses how each photosite on the camera sensor is performing with the amount of light that reaches the sensor. But as noted in that previous video, when shooting short subframes, you are exposing for the stack, not the subframe. Some photons or information will be captured on each individual subframe, and the shorter the subframe, the less information will be caught per exposure. And the histogram tool is going to reflect this lack of information in short subframes by presenting a light curve that's clipped off the left side of the histogram, in other words, indicating black clipping. And it's meaningless. Because, as we discussed earlier, the shorter your subframe exposure times, the more you're exposing for the stack and not the individual subframe. Think of it this way. The longer the exposure, the more you're exposing for the subframe. And the more then, you could rely on the histogram tool to give you reliable information. The shorter the exposure time, the more you're exposing for the stack, and the less reliable will the histogram become. Yet, short subframe exposure time still works because, in the stacker, the information of each subframe is added together, so that it's the total integration time that matters. And take note that there is no firm cutoff. Even though I arbitrarily define short subframe exposure times as anything 300 seconds or less, there's no actual hard cutoff where exposure time becomes long or short. It's really on a spectrum of variation. The longer the subframe exposure time, the more you're exposing for each individual subframe. The shorter the subframe exposure time, the more you're exposing for the stack. Now, the last observation came to me from Frank at SETI Astro, a man I have tremendous respect for. He's done a great deal for the astrophotography community. He created, insofar as I know, single-handedly the SETI Astro suite, and it just keeps getting better and better all the time. The last couple of videos that I made were highly technical, and my mind doesn't work that way. My field is in observational science. And so I wanted to run the video by Frank and see what he thought of the technical details. And he did point out that when shooting extremely faint objects, shooting long subframe exposure times was more efficient. I absolutely agree with him. And yet, I still don't shoot long subframe exposure times. And the natural question has to be, why? Because astrophotography is also photography. Exposure time matters a lot. And while we can look at some calculations and say, yes, this longer exposure time will give us some more efficiency and perhaps allow us theoretically to capture even fainter objects, I have to weigh the cost of that long exposure time against the reality of factors that we astrophotographers have to deal with. Our mounts are not perfect. They can experience periodic error and other problems. Any amount of wind can introduce vibration into the telescope or the mount. Even if you're using a heavy floating pier, vibration can be introduced into the mount through the ground. The atmosphere introduces seeing problems, and there is the additional risk of aircraft passing by, and these days, thousands upon thousands of annoying satellites overhead. And there are other risks too. For me, living way back in the Northwoods like I do, there is a risk that wildlife could interfere with an exposure, such as a bird perching in front of the telescope or an owl perching on the telescope, as has happened before. For those of you living in urban areas, neighbors turning on porch lights or shining flashlights. Basically, the longer your exposure, the more your exposure is at risk to all of those things and more. And I could go on, there's a lot more that could go wrong. The shorter your exposures, the less they are at risk from any one of these problems. And if you happen to lose a subframe due to one of them, it's no big deal. With short exposures, it's just a few seconds, maybe a minute or two. So when I'm shooting astrophotography objects, I have to balance an exposure time giving me the absolute most sensor efficiency and the ability to capture the faintest object possible against the potential problems that I and all astrophotographers have to contend with. It is for this exact same reason that all photographers tend to prefer to shoot the shortest exposure possible. There are some times that are exceptions, like if you wanted to artfully convey movements of water in a brook by shooting a longer exposure time to introduce blur. But apart from those rare exceptions, generally you want the shortest exposure time possible. And for the same reasons, short subframe exposure time astrophotography is advantageous. And does it make that much of a difference in how faint an object can be captured? I want to point out something. The famous Subaru telescope, which has an 8.2 meter mirror, has imaged objects down to magnitude 27.7. That is extremely dim, almost as dim as our atmosphere will allow. In this image of the Integrated Flux Nebula around the galaxy NGC 7497, the average magnitude is 24.5 per arc second. And if my little 203mm Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope's mirror can capture structure this faint, I'd say it's doing pretty good with 60-second short subframe exposure times. And I'm very certain it can capture fainter still. I just haven't gone and really measured its potential yet, though I think I'll find some of the answers that I'm looking for in this long integration time deep field image of extremely distant galaxies and quasars around NGC 4784 that I shot last winter. There are over 2,800 galaxies in that image, 2 sets of gravitationally lensed galaxies, and many quasars, all of which are very faint, many of them magnitude 20 and lower. My point is, when doing astrophotography, just like when doing regular photography, you have to ask yourself, just how much do you need to expose? What is your goal? To say that one has to do the maximum exposure to reveal every possible faint object every single time, it's like saying, hey, I want to photograph the barred owl at the edge of the forest in broad daylight, but I also absolutely must do a long exposure to make sure I reveal all the branches and any possible animals or insects that may be hiding in the forest shadows. And if I did that, I wouldn't have an owl, I'd have a blur. And I'm saying that I think we should treat astrophotography very much the same way. We should choose our imaging technique, including exposure time, based on the image we want to capture. In doing so, we can find the best compromise between the challenges of ground-based astrophotography shooting and our goals to maximize the amount of information that are captured by our camera sensors. And while short exposure times might not get the most efficiency out of each subframe exposure, they more than make up for that loss with the increased quality of the subframes, as they are far less subject to disturbances by mount errors in nature. So I believe here that I have replied to the oddest comments that I received and answered the most important questions. I'm sure there are others though, so if you have them, please let me know and I'll do my best to answer them for you. I can only answer them pertaining to my experience, but I cannot give you really good experience-based replies on how short frame sub-exposure times and light pollution interact. I live in the northern backwoods at a dark sky site, almost as dark as skies can get. I've lived in such sites pretty much most of my life except for my university days. And so I just have no real meaningful experience with modern techniques in dealing with light pollution. But I'll do my best to answer any other questions that you may have. I do want to leave one other observation with you. The reality is, modern telescope optics and cameras are so good that they can capture astoundingly faint information. Whether shooting short or long subframe exposure techniques, modern, ordinary telescopes, and I'm not even talking very professional telescopes, I'm just talking about things like the Celestron C8 like I am using, are well able to capture objects at a faintness below magnitude 24.5, which places their capabilities now on par with huge professional ground-based telescopes. Nevertheless, it's been my experience that when I make videos about these topics, there are always going to be some persons who are going to angrily declare such things cannot be done, even despite the objective evidence of the photographs right there in front of them, and I'm sure some of you have heard that. Don't let them limit you. Get out there and experiment. Test your equipment, your shooting ability, and your developing ability to its limits, and ignore the naysayers, the ones who tell you it can't be done. And I think you'll honestly be amazed at what you can accomplish. I mean, I will simply never forget all the people telling me when I first started this channel that I needed to get a refractor because you can't shoot good DSOs with a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, and I needed to stick with PixInsight because layer-based photo editing was not a good idea for astrophotography. There's always going to be those people telling you that you can't until you show them that, yes, you can. And finally, I want to add that choosing to shoot longer subframe exposure times is also a perfectly valid technique. In the end, the technique that you choose should depend on what your imaging goals are. What DSO do you want to capture? How much do you feel that you need to mitigate the effects of seeing and mount error? And how much risk in the shooting of each subframe are you willing to tolerate? Ultimately, in choosing subframe exposure time, those things matter a lot more than, are you going to get a few % more or less efficiency in your sensor? Or does the light curve nicely fill out your histogram? Alright, thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any other questions on this topic of exposure times in astrophotography, and I will do my best to answer them. Have fun doing astrophotography, and get out there and shoot the sky.